And we'll get started. Hope everyone's having a wonderful evening. Welcome everyone to the fifth Herp panel forum where we talk about all fun and exciting things Herp related. So we're happy to have you guys joining us with me today. We'll jump right into it. I have three panelists and we're going to discuss something I enjoy arguing with a bunch of people on Facebook about, and that's bridging the gap between science and the hobby, right? So what does academia have to say? What do hobbyists have to say? And how can we, all get along in this fun reptile hobby that we share? Joining me, I have Lori Torini, animal trainer and behaviorist, owner of Behavior Education LLC, and director of Spirit Keeper Equine Sanctuary, a 501c3 nonprofit animal sanctuary. Hi, Lori.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Happy to have you. Zach Loafman, he is a professor, is it evolutionary biology at West Liberty University?
Yeah, organismal biology and evolution.
Okay, organismal biology at West Liberty. Welcome, Zach. We're happy to have you.
Thank you.
And Dylan Perrin, host of the Animals at Home podcast. Welcome, Dylan. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much for having me on.
Good, good. So just kind of get us rolling. We'll start with just some introductions, and I'll ask you guys the same question I ask everyone while everyone's joining in. Starting with you, Dylan, what got you into reptiles? How'd you get in?
Well, I've always been an animal person from the beginning of my life. So I've had several different pets along the ways. And just at one point, I think maybe like 15, and I decided I wanted to get a reptile. I actually bought a Venus flytrap, and I built this extravagant terrarium for it because I live in this very dry climate. So then, I'm doing all this research, and then, there's a point on the website that says, once you've set up your terrarium, you might think about adding a reptile. And as soon as I saw that, that's just what hooked me. And that's when I first bought my crested gecko back in 2007, and I still have him today. He's sitting behind me. And that was sort of the original origin stories. And I didn't really start collecting more animals until about 5 years ago. And I only have 6, so I've tried to put a cap on it.
Awesome. And so where'd you say you fall sort of in that line between hobbyist and academia?
I am hobbyist, 100% hobbyist. Yeah, that's how I define myself.
Likewise. Well, we're happy to have you. Thank you, Dylan, for joining up. Zach, introduce yourself. Tell us how you got into reptiles and how does you work with them today?
Well, there's never been a time in my life where I didn't want to be a zoologist. I'm one of those people that when I was 2 or 3 years old, I didn't know what a zoologist was. I just knew that I liked animals and I wanted to go beyond just keeping them. I liked studying them in nature and seeing, what they do and their ecology and all that kind of good stuff. So reptiles have been ever present in my life. I was the obligatory dinosaur kid, and like most people, it was 3rd grade. I even remember the exact moment where I was like, I can't do this anymore because they're all dead. And we can get into the argument about birds, but it's really hard to catch a bird. And so I caught a garter snake, and then that garter snake was pretty much the catalyst to where I am today. And then as far as that, and then obviously I went into college. Reptiles, amphibians were ever present. Like I said, that's when I really got into herpetoculture and would say that I was absolutely a hobbyist at that point. I got a master's degree in a herpetology lab and studied reptile and amphibian communities in the field. And that took me, I couldn't take care of my animals at that point. So then I went pure academia with herpetology, though I've always had at least one snake since 97. Mm-hmm. And then I was completely out of herpetoculture until 2016, actually, when my university brought on this zoo science major, and I was informed that I had to manage it. And as part of that, I had to create an animal collection for the students and, twist my arm to develop a collection that I don't have to necessarily spend my money on. So I built it up. We have 200 animals, and then my responsibilities are to teach herpetoculture classes. So I'm kind of interesting because I'm also a hobbyist. I now have animals at my house that are, my personal collection. At the same time, I'm teaching a graduate level and an undergraduate level herpetoculture class and a herpetology class, which are similar but different. And now I have the evidence-based herpetoculture lab, which has graduate students in it. So I can hop on either side of the fence, but I would say that I'm definitely on the academic side, and that's why I'm here tonight.
Yeah,
Give
super.
that perspective.
Thank you, and congratulations too on all the new stuff that's that you're working on with the school, because I know a lot of it's in early stages with the university. And guys, if you aren't following I'll stop right now, the Animals at Home podcast, or following Zach's work on Facebook. Are you on Twitter or YouTube or anything? I don't think.
I'm just on Facebook and Instagram.
Okay. It's really interesting stuff. A lot of work with crayfish and other animals too. And our third panelist as well, Lori Torini, has a phenomenal, which I think is one of probably the most underrated YouTube channels on YouTube about behavior of reptiles too. So I won't spill everything. Lori, if you'd introduce yourself, please.
Yes. So I'm Lori. I had reptiles growing up, things like turtles and garter snakes, along with a slew of mammals. I've been an animal lover always. Our family has always had animals. I didn't get my first pet snake that was from a breeder until my early 20s, which was in the 1990s. And I just had that one until about 3 years ago, when I started getting some carpet pythons. I got one that had some behavioral difficulties, and I started training it. And then I saw a huge lack of behavior science and training theory and learning theory in the reptile community as a whole, and specifically with snakes. And when I retired from my full-time work 3 years ago, I decided I was already working full-time with animals, that I wanted to take my training and behavior business in the direction of snakes, because there's literally only a handful of people doing it. And it's needed, because I see things every day that snake keepers are doing that are causing bad relationships with their snakes, and they're not having smooth keeping experiences with their snakes. And that could all be avoided quite easily if people were just a little bit more knowledgeable about animal training and behavior science.
I think that's an excellent point. And one of the reasons I like out of your channel too, when I first, full transparency here, when I first saw it, I thought snake training, like, I'm thinking circus acts, right? Is it, am I going to get it to bounce a ball? Like, what am I going to train a snake to do? And even still, there's a number of things that I don't frankly have the time to work with, and I regret a little bit, but there's a lot of things that I pick up from that channel, just in terms of the behavior education, that just learning about these issues is super important. It's the same thing with your dog. An animal, I jump to that because obviously snakes and dogs very different, but it's an animal that a lot of people recognize as a common pet. You don't have to learn how to, you don't have to teach it shits in training and have it be command to sit, walk backwards, charge, attack, release, all that stuff, to know that learning the behavior of the animal is crucial in that relationship that we have with keeping our pet. And I think there's a lot to that, and just sort of the videos that you put out really help bridge that gap between starting something completely blind and actually being able to interact with these reptiles in a thoughtful manner that is thoughtful on their behalf, which I think so many people don't do. So happy to have you. Happy to have all three of you guys. I'll jump in. I will say this to the audience as well. If you're listening, if you come up with a question at any time, feel free to throw it in the chat box. I'll be reading those. We may or may not answer them right in the middle of the discussion. Usually what I like to do is, if you type up a chat question, something that you want to get to, even if it's just a topic, hey, can you discuss this? Throw it in the chat. If I don't get to it during the discussion, we'll get to it at the end, like when we do audience questions, right? We'll start with the written ones. So that's a great way to ask and get a question answered that you may have. So please utilize that chat function, and we'll take it from there. That's the benefit of joining these things live instead of watching them on YouTube. When I first started this forum, I actually named it Herpetological Panel Forums, and I recently changed the name just to Herp Panel Forums. I shorted it, I took the tological out of it, because I realized that I may have been misrepresenting the panel, as I've had breeders, cage builders, and PhDs on the panels. But is that important? So I wanted to ask the topic of the question, is that important? Is there a gap between herpetology or academia and the hobbyist? And why do you think that is? And I'll start with you, Zach, on that one. Is there a gap between the hobbyist and science?
I think it really depends on the individual. I don't think that one thing that I will say that is rampant in the herp hobby are absolute statements where you basically make some kind of grand, people will make some kind of splash online and say, you know, racks are the only way to keep, or PVC enclosures are the only way to keep. And if people could just kind of get to the middle, and if you're an academic, you're in the process, you're in the business of learning, that in generating fact. And so you're always going to be questioning what you're doing and trying to figure out if you're doing it best, which means you're going to be open to different opinions from other people. And somebody might challenge you on something. And that certainly doesn't mean that it's the end of the world. It just simply means you've got to kind of pontificate and think about what you're doing and justify it or defend it or debate it. That's the academic process. Within the herpetoculture hobby, not so much the herpetoculture discipline, and I think there's a difference there. You get these tribes, and the tribalism is rampant. And you can totally get tribes in academia. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but we're taught as academics to try to avoid that and remain objective, at least in the fields of science. I can say that as someone. And as an example, when I do my crayfish research, I published a paper once and I put it out into the ether and it got through peer review. And somebody in my field challenged it, did a whole study, discredited it.
Mm-hmm.
But I left in the end thinking, okay, cool. Then that's not the way to do this then. And then when I saw the guy, you know, it was like, hey, how's it going at the next conference? It wasn't this, you know, you're a complete blankety blank. Like that's part of the process, is to challenge the ideas and to push forward and advance the field. The herpetoculture hobby, I don't see that happening all the time. And that's what's led to this minimalistic keeping versus naturalistic keeping, you know, dogma and tribe. Whereas the herpetoculture discipline, which is a little bit different, that's what zoos would be doing. That's what people that are actually like studying UVB to see in something like a snake, like what does it do in the snake? It's just, the approach is very, very different. So I don't know if I feel like I'm kind of rambling a little bit here,
That's
but
good. No, you're
it's hard to, you know, kind of put your finger on it. But I think it's important to kind of segregate the two. The herpetoculture hobby and the herpetoculture discipline, like professional herpetoculturists at zoos, universities, even in field of conservation, just a very different dynamic over there than it is in the hobby.
I think you answered that great, and I'll follow it up, and then I'll let everyone else weigh in on it too. But I'll follow it up, Zach, with where do you find, and this is totally one man's opinion, but your informed opinion, where do you find there's the biggest gap between academia and the hobby?
One thing that really bothers me is this perception that all academics look down on the hobby. I get that a lot. People are oftentimes shocked when they'll message me on Facebook to ask me this question. And it'll be, oftentimes it's like, you can tell that the person spent a real long time trying to word it just right. And then I just respond with like something to the effect of, yeah, that's cool. Like they're shocked that I can talk that way. Mm-hmm. Like, you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Like we're not all in this hypothetical ivory tower. We're all nerds. That's what we are. And you know, if you're going to dedicate your life to copious amounts of discipline, or sorry, not discipline, you know, learning about one little micro subject in the field of biology, in my case, you have to be able to geek out. And I would argue that the vast majority of reptile keepers, there's an element of nerddom there that many people, like myself included, you know, that's a term of endearment. That's not an insult as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
But yeah, I think that there's this perception that, you know, we're high and mighty. And I will say this, though, there are absolutely people in academia that do look down on hobbyists and don't think that, you know, they're really contributing to science in any way. I'm not one of them. I try to ride the middle as much as possible and see the you know, the good and the bad of both sides and kind of make my own conclusions.
Do you get any pushback from your peers? Because I know you do keep snakes and you do make jokes about their poop on Facebook. And yes. You know, do you get pushback from your peers and academics around that?
Not really. Let me back that up. I haven't gotten it. No one has flat out called me out on it or made a reference. I've definitely had a couple conversations that were a little tense. Uh, I'm on the board for the state of West Virginia. Well, it's not really an official board; it's a voluntary board. But the state herpetologist kind of brings all the herp-minded folks together once a year, and then we talk about conservation priorities and how we should move forward. And we were in a meeting one time, and there was this discussion about breeding wood turtles for release and whether we should do that or not. And I was on side, yes, we should do, it's called ex situ conservation. And then there were a couple other people that said, well, we should be putting the money more towards studying the animals in the field. So I was kind of representing herpetoculture in that dynamic. But here again, it's just a different universe because I can give a counter argument in that setting, and the other guy will give the counter argument to my argument, and we walk away friends because the ultimate goal is to come out with the best thing for the wood turtle, if that makes sense. And I feel like in the hobby side of herpetoculture, egos are just ever freaking present, and they should go away. Like if you've earned your right to keep, or you've kept snakes for 35 years, that does not mean that you're the best keeper on planet Earth. That just means you've kept snakes for 35 years. You know, you can always learn something. And that's the argument that pops up time and time again on Facebook.
I like it. Lori, what would you say about the gap between the hobby and academia?
The gaps that I've encountered have been, one, I have corresponded with people who study snakes in situ in the wild who are actually against keeping them under captive management. So they study species in the wild, but they're not supportive of keeping them under captivity because of a whole bunch of reasons. So obviously there's a huge disconnect between that type of academic and the people who are keeping snakes as family or keeping them for other reasons. And the other gap I've noticed is sort of the opposite. The people who are keeping snakes and are caretakers of snakes aren't looking to academics to get information that's critical to their care and training. The first thing I do is go to Google Scholar when I work with a new species, because I want to know what their natural biology is. How do they perceive the world? Because that's crucial when I'm setting up a training environment for them and deciding on how I'm going to communicate with them during a training session. I also need to know what their natural history is like, because antecedent arrangement, when I'm setting up the training environment, it's critical to know the animal's natural history so that I can set up an antecedent arrangement and a training environment that's meaningful to them as an animal. So it doesn't matter how I may want to train or what I may want to use as a cue. It has to be something the animal can perceive, something they can understand, and something that is in keeping with their natural history, how they would behave in the wild. And animal caretakers aren't taking the time to look up these things that are readily available in scientific journals and in some cases lay journals. They're just not taking the time to do the research to know any of these things about the species that they're keeping. And I think that that's sad, because there is information out there on many species of animals, many species of snakes, about their natural biology, their natural history, their behavior, and yes, even training. When I first started looking into training snakes, I was actually surprised that I found so many previous people had done snake training studies, and it's out there in the literature and nobody knows about it. Nobody talks about it. Nobody bothers to look these things up. They just want to go with what people have told them over and over, word of mouth. So that's sad, because there's a huge disconnect, because the information that's available isn't being utilized by many keepers and caretakers.
Yeah, well put. And you brought up some points that I definitely want to circle back onto, because they lead into some other thoughts that I wanted to get to. But I do want Dylan to weigh in on this as well.
Well, I think an important thing to realize is we're talking about bridging the gap between these two worlds. We're not talking about closing the gap, because these are two separate entities, and they always will be. And there are people who keep reptiles who aren't interested in interacting with the science side of it, which is actually okay. Like, we have to remember I think in 2010, there was like 5 million homes that had reptiles in them. So you can imagine the vast amount of those homes that aren't interacting with the hobby like we are. So, I mean, on Facebook, even a large Facebook group is like 30 or 40,000 people, but that's a drop in the bucket compared to like the guy that goes to Petco and follows the instructions. So there are people out there that don't even really realize that's an option, and they might not even want to interact with the hobby that way. So that's one thing to consider. And I think that's, Zach's talking about the academics that don't like the hobby, and same with Lori. Those are the people they see. They don't see the people advancing care. They see, the guy with the half dead leopard gecko in his backyard, or in his back room. And so I think as our job is to try and lift the level of care to that conscientious level where that it's trickling down to the lower, I don't want to call them lower level keepers. They're just keepers who aren't as involved in the hobby, because we can't expect everybody to go pick up a scientific journal like we do, but maybe us setting the standard will slowly make something like a Petco change, the care that they hand out when someone goes home with a crested gecko or leopard gecko, for example. So that's kind of how I see it. I do see them as separate worlds, and we are the bridge between those two worlds, the people that are happy to walk between both.
Okay, so that is an excellent question, because there are plenty, and I've surrounded myself with as many as I can anyways, but I see it on both sides, with groups that are very informative. Sites like the Reptile Lighting, I know we have one of the admins in here that is extremely beneficial and extremely informative, and probably one of the most essential, if not the most essential aspect of reptile keeping. And then there's other groups I'm into, and we discussed this beforehand, and that someone else brought it up too, Lori or Zach, that snakes need as small of an enclosure as possible because they like tight spaces. Like, so there's some groups that are really, really, really trying to push it, and other groups that are really, really stuck in their ways. And the way you described conversations in academia, where someone will tell you, they'll discredit your paper, and you say, wow, I learned something. I'm ready to go back and revisit my findings and my procedure and learn from it. So much of that is the complete opposite in the hobby, where it's just, I'm right, and then they're gonna fight. My question is Facebook, which I think is probably the most common sort of chat room that we have accessible for this, is that a toxic environment to learn? Is there a benefit to it? Lori, what do you think? Thoughts on Facebook?
Yeah, I mean, I use social media a lot because that's where most people who are the type of people that Dylan described, that might have one reptile or a couple as family pets, and they don't want to go to Google Scholar and look up scientific journal articles. They go to social media, they watch YouTube, they go to Facebook or Instagram to see not only photos, but to get information. And I'm very comfortable on those forums, and I have no problem putting out information on those forums and corresponding with people that way. But I think as individuals, we have to control how toxic that environment gets or not. And I feel that I manage that very well, because if someone posts something inappropriate that's on a page that's mine, that I control, I can very easily push the delete button. Not good discussion, not good debate, but I mean, just something that's hateful or something that's not based in fact or science. Those things I won't tolerate. And if I'm in another group and there's a discussion going back and forth, and I have given the information that is available to me that I know of as a behavior scientist and as a trainer, I mean, those are my expertise. I give the information I know, and I always cite sources. I'm not then going to argue with anyone back and forth, because at that point, there's no argument to make. I've given you the information, I've given you the data, I've given you the places to look it up yourself. So there's nothing to debate. So then I won't engage in that communication any longer, because there's no point. So I think if people are getting into the arguments on social media, or they're getting their feelings hurt on social media, it's because they aren't managing it well. You know, they're not taking a stand on what their own parameters are in the use of that media.
Well said. And Zach, we got you muted there too. Dylan, would you care to weigh in on that as well?
Sorry, my misters were going off. That's why I muted myself.
Oh.
No. I mean, you have caught me on a day where yesterday, for the first time in several years, I got into a horrible Facebook thing that I normally don't even let myself get drawn into. So it reminded me how ridiculous it can get. So, but there are some serious benefits to it. And like Lori's saying, there's so many people that will go to Facebook first. You're going to look for a group. They're not going to go to Google Scholar, and which is totally fine. when we say somebody doesn't want to interact with science to improve their care, that doesn't actually imply anything about their animal welfare standards. It just implies the way they want to interact with the hobby. So, and we've already mentioned those amazing Facebook groups, and those are growing. You know, writing things in stone is a common thing in these Facebook groups, and that's got to be the biggest issue, and it is very tough to overcome. The things I can't even imagine, like the conversations I was having yesterday in this group was really, really mind blowing to me. And
real quick hits? What were they?
Well, classic. We were talking about spider gene, and I'm not even like, of course, I'm not a morph guy or anything, but I shared something about talking about how this is not an ideal thing to be perpetuating, and I got lit up for this, which it was fine, but I was just surprised at the logic that, like, I'll give you two pieces of logic that they gave me. So, of course, we're all familiar with the spider wobble. That's the issue with this morph. So to defend that, they said, hey, you shouldn't talk about spider. There's a whole list of other morphs that also cause neurological and genetic disorders that you're not even talking about. So why are you just focusing on one? As if that fact was a slam dunk to defend spider gene.
Yeah.
So it was just a bizarre scenario. So that really and there was another point that they made that I can't remember. It was just as ridiculous. So yeah, it's a tough world to be in. I think fortunately we have some great ones that are slowly growing, and I hope that does take over the next few years.
Awesome. Thank you. Zach, what do you think about the toxicity of the online sort of reptile debate?
I think it's exhausting. That's what I think. I don't. It's a rarity to find a group that really understands how to educate, because if you're educating, you have to be open to new ideas, and you have to be wanting to push your gaining of not like the main point to education is to learn, and in learning you might let go of something that you've done forever because you've acquired new fact that's then changed your practice. And what I see in those groups is just this kind of tribalism, and even the good groups have tribalism. There's this. I'm an admin for the Advancing Herpetological Husbandry group, which is an amazing resource. I actually use that for my classes because the files section, there's over 50 journal articles on all kinds of topics relevant to herpetoculture. But at the same time, you can get into absolute battles, in that group. But I think that a group that has a good, like what Lori was alluding to, if there are moderators that are actually trying to limit the so-called drama and just get that negativity and that toxicity out of there, what you'll be left behind with is you may not have the biggest population in the Facebook group, but you're probably going to have a situation where you have quality over quantity. Those that know me know my favorite snakes are false water cobras. And there are two Facebook groups. One's called False Water Cobra, and then the other one's called The False Water Cobra. And what I love about those groups is that people have differences of opinion, and people come there to learn. And the moderators in those groups, and I'll fully admit I'm one of them, as soon as we start to pick up any kind of drama, i.e. someone's in there throwing negativity, it's just eliminated. But we've totally had people debate enclosure size, temperatures, feeding rate, how often you feed, and it's been good, So I think it can be used for good. Now, I will say that I am the exception, not the rule, in academia when it comes to social media, because I can flat out tell you there are biologists that I know that would be like, so you're promoting social media as a way to acquire fact? Just so you know. That is something that need to say, but I think that it can be used as a tool. But I think it whoever is the moderator of the group has to actually do their job. And so these groups where it's like the Wild West, that's just, there's no learning there. For example, there's a carpet python group, and I see that Dr. Baines is here, and I had infrared heat panels in my enclosures. As a heating mechanism, actually for my personal collection at home. And I went to a meeting where I saw Dr. Baines talk, and she basically, threw out how those things work to heat. And I learned in that moment, like, oh, well, that makes a whole lot of sense. And those things are getting ripped out of my enclosures the second I get home, because of the way that they heat, and they don't do the deep penetration to the muscle and all that kind of stuff. So we were in a carpet python group, and somebody posed the question, are infrared heat panels good for my snake? And I put in there, well, actually, blah, 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 blah. And then it was, oh, he's just one of those crazy naturalistic people. I was literally called a crazy naturalistic person. No, crazy bioactive person. And I was just like, well, how the hell are you going to learn if this is what we're leading with? And then it was just like piling onto the fire. So I just left the group. I was out. Like, there's no sense being there. To Lori's point.
I think that's a really great point. And one of the reasons why I wanted to ask this question, and it's something I noticed. I don't want to say any generalizations, right? Because anytime you do that, you're wrong.
Yeah.
But I noticed that a number of young people are very, very in tune with social media for their resources, which is great. Why, sites like Reptile Lighting, Advancing Herpetological Husbandry, because they do have all the facts and the files and resources and knowledge and things like that. But there's also a lot of YouTube and a lot of feed my pet videos and top 10 reptiles for beginners from someone who owns like 2 of those reptiles on YouTube. And that's where a lot of people are getting their information. One of the channels I really enjoy, Reach Out Reptiles. Lori, I know you have a Talsetti comes from Reach Out Reptiles.
Yeah.
But one of the employees there who I really enjoy, Aiden, they were doing a debate with Garrett and Aiden, or a lightning round or something. And someone asked, what's the last book he read? And he laughed and he's like, I can't remember the last book I read. And Garrett says, what about a reptile book? And he says, I don't read reptile books. I get everything I need to know from YouTube and Facebook. And like, I almost died. Like, I don't have, I didn't have them here. I was going to stack them up, but I got a stack of books, and it's a small stack of books, but it's like this deep, plus like a folder on my computer of files. But I thought, maybe that's most people, right? That aren't getting their information like that. So, I think it's valuable to have that be good, right? If that makes sense. So the good groups are valuable to have, because for some people that's all they have. I have a book on neotropical tree boas that I thought was interesting. I don't own any neotropical tree boas. I wanted to read the book, but it was $75. And I know a lot of people don't have $75 to spend on a book, especially for a reptile they don't own, let alone one they do own. So I do feel like there's an important bridge there. And I don't really have a question that follows that, but that's where I wanted to go. What can we reverse it though? So we'll start with you, Dylan. Can you think of any situations where the opposite is true, where hobbyists know something that academia doesn't?
Well, the hobby is obviously very good at husbandry. That is what we do. Now, that of course we can't use a blanket statement for everybody, but if you are looking for somebody if you're looking for an individual who would know how to care for a specific species, you'll go to the hobby, because we spend money here, we spend our time here. It doesn't have to go through a board approval. You have people that are tinkering and working on these projects for years. So husbandry is a huge part. All the time, academics will go to the hobby to figure out how to care for a species before they bring it into, a study that they're doing. And, just off the top of my head, Vin Russo, obviously a big bull. Oh, did I freeze?
For a second.
Did I freeze for a second?
For a second.
Okay. Okay, yeah. Vin Russo, obviously a breeder, boa breeder. He's done lots of work with Dr. Scott Boback. They've done a bunch of genetic work, because Vin is obviously very well versed in locality boas and whatnot. And Corey Aymar, who I just had on my podcast last week, it'll be out next week, has an amazing croc monitor breeding facility in San Diego. And he's done all this, had some DNA testing, and they've established primers for allowing people to go, submit DNAs from their monitor species to develop relatedness tests. And even those have been published as well to prove parthenogenic births and all sorts of different things. And then I would throw Lori into that category. Absolutely. This is somebody who is in the hobby, but also trailblazing far beyond what we had. Like, science is behind Lori right now. So that's another great example of, she's kind of laughing, but it's true. Like, you see the stuff that Lori's doing. Yes, there is research that shows that, but nobody's doing it like Lori. So there are plenty of examples of when the hobby has more room to work with, because it's a hobby and we can tinker with things.
Yeah, well put. Lori, what are your thoughts? Are you beyond science?
No. I look at science every day to answer questions, but when I don't find answers in science, then that's when I have to do my own research. Mm-hmm. And that's what it's come down to with some of the behavior and training, specifically with snakes. There are some training and behavior journal articles that have been peer reviewed and published specifically with snakes, but only a handful. And then there aren't a lot of cooperative care behaviors like stationing for weighing, stationing for radiographs, ultrasounds, holding in position for injections and blood draws that have been done so far with snakes. And I'm working on some of those. But with the species that's not very tactile by nature, that's difficult. It's not impossible, but it's a challenge. But I think that people who keep snakes as family pets, or people who keep large numbers of snakes who are breeders, or like me, I don't breed, but I keep a large number of snakes here because I'm studying behavior and I'm training them, are going to see things that an academic is not going to see in situ, and they're not going to see in a laboratory. Like I've noticed behavioral things with some of the snakes, and I've contacted people and reached out to people about them, and they flat out have told me, well, I wouldn't necessarily notice that because I'm not looking at the snakes every day the way you are. I'm not watching their behavior, you know, at certain intervals during the day like you are. And it was specifically just a slight neurological glitch that I thought I saw in a specific pattern, and I wondered if that could be linked to that pattern of snake. And it's so minor that I think probably even someone who had this snake as a pet wouldn't notice, but I notice it because that's all I do is watch their body movement and their behavior. And so the breeder who has way more of this species than I do said, I would never notice that, you know, but you're in a position to see that. And so he said, it's something we need to keep track of. It's something that we need to keep in the back of our minds in case something comes of it down the road.
That's fascinating. Zach, I saw you popped your hand up there for a second. Did you want to add something?
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to, Lori's being very modest. I have the graduate lab, and I went to Lori to help my graduate student, Michelle, who she's been absolutely an amazing mentor for, because I knew that Lori was at the cutting edge of snake ethology. So, but to your question, though, I can definitely say when it comes to reproductive biology and physiology, in many ways, I think that herpetoculture can absolutely help the field of herpetology, because a lot of these animals, when you're a herpetologist in the field, it's a rare event for you to actually be able to have a population of reptiles that's large enough for you to go out and capture every aspect of their biology. I mean, that just does not happen. If you read field studies, there's always, a sample size of maybe 150 snakes over 5 years. And that's really not that many animals if you think about it. So you're going to miss key aspects of their biology. And when it comes to like the reproductive cycle, the total number of offspring that an animal can have, the total number of reproductive events an animal can have and over its lifetime or a 12-month cycle, I think herpetoculture can definitely help with that. Describing reproductive behaviors, even though it is ex situ, it's out of nature, you obviously have to incorporate that into the justification or writing up or whatever it is you're doing, the conclusions you're making. But you're still going to be able to at least say at the end, this snake is able to lay this many eggs, or this snake can have this many babies. And a lot of times that's kind of missing. So I know when it comes to that aspect, herpetoculture can definitely help. And describing, like what Lori does, a lot of these behaviors that the animals do.
That's a great point. Yeah, a breeder, someone that breeds 40 females every season is going to see way more than even a researcher who's looking for exactly that. What a find that would be to find 40 females all breeding in the same season. You get tremendous data from that. So great point. Kind of on what we've been talking about too, and I see it and Zach, you brought it up too, but I see it a lot with Dylan and Lauren. Dylan and Lori on your posts. the people are real quick to criticize. A lot of people are quick to say, and kind of the way I made a joke about it right at the beginning, like, oh, am I going to teach my snake circus tricks? But it's more than that. Like, people genuinely have criticism, despite the fact that they're wrong. and so, Lori, we'll start with you. Why do you think, and this is, outside of all of our realm, this is into human psychology. Why do you think people want to resist good information?
People don't like to change. And when people have heard something told to them over and over again for a very long time, they don't like to be told that what they've always thought was correct is wrong, or that there's a better way than what they've always known. And I encounter this in all aspects of animal training, in the horse world, in the dog world, with snakes, especially and it's not as prevalent in the dog world anymore, because I think that's one of the species. I mean, we've co-evolved with them and done so much research on behavior and training and biology and cognition with dogs. People don't debate it as much. But in the horse world, I think it's even worse than the snake world in trying to elicit change in the way that people train horses and the way that people care for horses, even medically. And it's just because you've heard something all your life, and you don't want to be told that what you thought was true is wrong. There's nothing wrong with changing your mind in light of new information. There's absolutely nothing wrong with changing the way you do something when you have new evidence to say that there's a better way or a different way. And I do that every day, immediately. I don't even give it time. If I find out new information today that is supported by science that says something I've been doing is wrong, or that there's a better way, it's changed. It's changed immediately. Not, oh, well, I'll change that next week. No, it's changed right now. Or I throw something out the window if I find out that it's not good. It's difficult for people to change. They don't like change. They don't like to learn new things. And it's easier to just listen to what somebody's telling you than go look information up yourself. And that's why whenever I do post on social media, or I produce a video on YouTube, there's always sources cited in the description, or I say where the information came from, because you shouldn't just take my word for it because I'm on social media saying it. If you can't go look it up yourself, and if it's not supported by evidence, then I'm not going to say it. And if I do say something that's just my opinion or speculation, then I will preface it with that. Hey, this is just my opinion, or this is just me speculating here, but I think this. Otherwise, I'm going to tell you where that information came from and where you can look it up yourself. Unfortunately, many people just don't want to do that. They just want to believe what anyone tells them. And unfortunately, I've met a lot of people who can't even think for themselves. So I might tell them one thing and they believe me. And then 3 days later, somebody else tells them different. So they change to what that person told them. And I mean, I literally took in a horse at our rescue that had so many different trainers. It's no wonder it has behavior issues, because it's got to be so confused by now. It doesn't know what's what. Because every other week, the owner was taking it to a different trainer who had a completely different style of training, a different training philosophy, and was teaching it something completely different. So I see a lot of that. And I think that people don't like to take the time and make the effort to look things up and to check the veracity of sources. And then they just don't want to believe that something they thought was right is wrong.
I hear all of what you're saying. I completely agree with that. Zach, what do you think on this?
Exactly what Lori said. Really can't say it more articulate than that. That's I'm tapping out what she said.
Dylan, how about you? Can you top Lori?
I definitely can't top Lori, but I could add a little bit of it. One of the things that Zach says in his paper that he just published was the idea that I've been doing this for X amount of years, therefore I must know. And that's a very tough thing to overcome. That's sort of what Lori's alluding to as well. And, there is this, when you're providing new information, and I hate to say this, but it's sort of an American, we kind of talked about this already, an American sort of Western attitude. If I give you a piece of information that contradicts how you're currently caring for your animal, it sort of implies that I'm now infringing on your rights to behave freely. And I see that as a very aggressive pushback. It's actually tough to get over that. And the other thing is, as I had already said, many people are in the hobby. They don't interact with it in the same way that we do. Like, we see it as a science project. I don't care if you're a hobbyist or you're an academic. That is how we interact with the hobby. But many people actually don't. So if that is not our mindset, so it's kind of tough to put ourselves in their shoes, where it's like, what I'm doing here is just caring for a snake. I'm giving it a rat every 2 weeks and just changing its water dish. This has nothing to do with biology for me. And that's actually an issue, because this is when we get into issues with welfare. So that is really the gap that we need to actually work at bridging, is delivering the information in a way that maybe the person doesn't write it off immediately. Maybe they go home and think about it, or maybe the next time they see their animal, they'll go, maybe they had a point there, or something along those lines. So that is that refuting a science happens, I think, because people are in the hobby for a different reason.
I think that's a great point. And Zach, I can't believe I had it on my notes to mention too, but can you tell us what the name of your the most recent paper you wrote was, or the topic?
Okay, good. I can tell you the topic.
Yeah, I have it right here.
Oh, Dylan, why don't you pitch it and
utilization of natural history information in evidence-based herpetoculture.
Right. It's so perfect. I was sitting there. I was I little inside baseball. I messaged Dylan. I was like, hey, I've got this idea for a panel for him, and I'd love for you to be on. He's like, oh, great. I just filmed one with Zach on that exact same topic. It's coming out. So I'll put a link to Dylan's video in the YouTube, and to Zach's paper as well, because they had a phenomenal conversation that partly inspired where we are here today too. So thank you, gentlemen, both for blazing the trails on that one before me here. And I also wanted to bring up to an audience question now, because it was very similar to a question I was going to ask, but I think he said it better than me. And it's almost like he was in our prior conversation. So Rigo Cervantes asked, do you think there should be more regulations with keeping herps? If yes, how can they be implemented? So it is not one step toward banning keeping. And then also, what are your thoughts on USARK? So maybe, Lori, would you like to start this one? We kind of discussed this before the meeting.
So, yeah, but I want to preface this with something I didn't say before the meeting, is that when I look at standards and how animals should be kept, I am 100% looking at it from the animal's perspective. Given that they are under captive management, and nobody in this talk can change that. They're here, they're in captivity. So given that premise, and starting with that premise, I am going to always look at how can we keep them in the best manner possible for their welfare, not for the ease of the keeper or the ease of the breeder, but for the animal. And so, yes, I think that everybody should be held to minimum standards. And I believe that because I see that people aren't holding themselves to what are the best standards for the animal. And when people aren't able to do that on their own, then that needs to be regulated. And there are organizations out there, USARK being one of them. And I have no problem with USARK's mission to support reptile keeping. There needs to be organizations that support reptile keeping. But if an organization says that they hold people to a certain standard and it's the highest standard, but you don't list what those standards are, you don't tell me what those standards look like, when you don't define what those standards are, then it's hard for me to support you. You can't just make that statement and not define what those standards are. And that's just my only issue with USARK, is that is stated on their website. And then I searched and even filled out their contact form twice and got no response, wanting to know what they considered highest standards, because they said it, but it wasn't outlined, and I didn't get any response. And so as an organization, if you want to support reptile keeping as a right that people should have, then do that, but don't then add animal welfare into your website and say that you hold people to the highest standard, because you haven't even defined it or told me what that looks like at all.
Great point. Dylan, what are your thoughts?
It is actually a very tough question. I don't really have any thoughts on USARK being in Canada. I don't interact with that organization very much. I would share similar thoughts to Lori on that one. It's great that you have a foundation that's protecting the privilege to keep animals in to some extent. I have always, the idea of regulation is a tough one, because the first question that comes after you discuss a regulation is how do you enforce it? And that really is the main question. We can actually just jump over what would the regulations be to how do we enforce that? And it's almost an impossible thing to enforce, as far as I can tell, without the extent of, having house visits and things like that. I just don't know how you would do it. So I do and I've always said this, I think it has to come from us in the reptile hobby. We need to be people striving for change. We need to hold each other accountable. And over time, hopefully our standards increase as a group because as soon as we let a government outline regulations that we must follow, it can be very tough to have the freedom that we might want. And so I don't know. I do very much think that it needs to come from us. If we can continue to set an example, I hope that would be something that would be better than having a regulation come down. And then of course the question mark of how to enforce it is a whole other ballgame.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Zach?
When it comes to the reptile regulation aspect of things, we're not talking about it right now, but one of the hats that I wear is I am a conservation biologist. So, I helped get 2 crayfish listed on the fish on the federal endangered species list. And in that process, obviously there weren't people that were collecting the animals or anything like that. But I kind of saw the side of the regulation that hobbyists don't see, which is the why it has to happen, and the ultimate purpose of it to benefit the resource, which would be the animals in question. And so I think that the hobby side of herpetoculture has its role to basically police itself, in that we as a group really need to look inward and make a decision as to why we are holding up king cobras like this on Instagram to get 1,500 likes.
To get 1,500 likes, Zach?
Yeah, but if you're someone who's trying to make a decision as to whether this city needs an ordinance for venomous reptiles or not, if that doesn't exist, if you're the person who's going to write that regulation and you never see that aspect, it's not going to trigger you. But if if all you see is people being super responsible and doing this the proper way, you're not going to be highly regulated. But if you have people doing that, I'm sorry, I totally understand why a city manager would look at that and be like, oh hell, we can't have this.
Exactly.
And then it's a very slippery slope to everything's being regulated. So I oftentimes look at the herp hobby and think that we are our own worst enemy a lot of the time.
So true.
All really, really great answers. And I think a lot of truth to that. This is something I'll jump in here too, because this is something I know a little bit about when it comes to animal welfare regulations for certain municipalities. So Rigo, you kind of answered your own second part of the question. You said, how can it be implemented so it's not one step toward banning reptile keeping? And then you said, what are your thoughts on USARC? Well, that's what USARC does, right? They make sure that when there are reptile laws passed, that they're I'm trying not to say just or equitable, because as we discussed earlier, I don't believe reptile keeping is a right, it's a privilege, but that they're reasonable, right? And that they're smart and they're workable, and they still allow us to keep this hobby because it is a safe hobby and it is beneficial. But as far as regulations go, we regulate just about every other pet. We regulate equines, we regulate dogs, cats. They have strict licensing laws, strict breeding laws, and it can be done. Things are outlined. It's outlined how long a tether can be for a dog, and how long its cage has to be, how high off the ground its shelter needs to be, how many sides, very specific details. There's no reason why a municipality couldn't say if you're keeping snakes, they have to have UVB light. I don't know if USARC is going to jump in, because a lot of keepers, right? That's a hot debate. Whether it should be or not is a whole nother subject. But the fact of the matter is, an agency might say, hey, there's so many keepers that don't do that, blah, blah, blah. That's where USARC comes in. That's their job. But a city or a state could very easily say, these are the guidelines that we're setting forth. If you keep a snake, it has to have this length of enclosure as a minimum. It has to have clean, fresh water, et cetera, et cetera. Heat, UV, those can all be regulated. And how do you enforce it? Well, you make it so that, one, if someone gets a complaint, then they called out. How often is that going to happen? Not very often. Two, you can monitor social media for exactly what Zach talked about, like the free handling of cobras. Like, well, it's the venomous violation. Animal Services is coming to visit. But also, and this is where people get upset because they feel like it's a cash grab, permits. So if you want to ever sell a snake online, or a bearded dragon, or a blue-tongued skink, you need a permit to sell that animal. And that permit has to be renewed annually, and it comes with an inspection, right? So then you get in the debate of just big government for small government. And that is for another topic altogether. But it can be done, and we do it with other animals already. And if they did it with reptiles, I'm sure glad that USARK is around to make sure it doesn't get too far. But also, okay, like if it means that the reptiles are being kept better and hobbyists are forced to be better, or at least moving towards it, then it's worth exploring. That's
I mean,
anyways,
I can say something about the enforcement if you want, just real quick, and how that works, because Dylan asked a good question. How would you ever enforce that? And I'm a retired law enforcement officer. I've worked both in human law enforcement and animal law enforcement. And the way that animal law enforcement is enforced is somebody reports a violation. So it isn't that inspectors are going to go around and knock on your door and come in your house and want to see all of the animals that you own. That's how we uncover horse neglect cases. Is a neighbor usually calls and says, this horse is super skinny. So then somebody goes out and investigates it. So it's kind of a reactive part of law enforcement. So it would not be enforced, I don't think, on the front end proactively, where people would be doing inspections of facilities and homes and things. It would be somebody notices an issue with somebody's reptile and they report it, and then you would get that knock on the door that says, hey, this was reported, we need to come and inspect your habitat, or whatever it is.
Yeah, well put. Cool. Moving forward to a new question, and feel free to spend as much time as we want on this. And Zach, we brought this up earlier. Someone asked, an audience member asked a question, but I'll phrase it shorter. Is private keeping, is that conservation?
My answer to that is yes and no. If you are actually it depends on what you're doing as a keeper. So one of the things I do as a crayfish biologist, which is totally relevant to this question, is I'm currently developing a protocol to rear these endangered crayfish in human care to ultimately release out into the wild to repopulate streams in Appalachia where they no longer exist. And that's kind of the benchmark standard that a lot of people in the hobby really want, our practices to do. And there are absolutely groups that have figured out a way to do that. The Turtle Survival Alliance, the turtle people really are the ones that are kind of pushing this, part of the blending the hobby into the conservation world nicely. But I can tell you, it's the process I'm undergoing to get that done with these endangered animals. It is far more complicated than simply breeding a bunch of crayfish and putting them in the stream. So one of the things I have to do is when I breed these animals, ultimately, I have to figure out who is the most unrelated to each individual, and ultimately breed in a way where I'm going to increase the overall genetic diversity. And if you think of what a lot of hobbyists do, you get a pair where it's a brother and a sister, and then you breed that pair together, and you have absolutely no genetic diversity. And it doesn't matter if that pair of snakes it produces ultimately 200 or 300 individuals. They're essentially biologically clones of each other. Now, there are absolutely situations where in the wild, we get down to an effective population size that's really small, and that's what we have, and that's what we have to work with. But ultimately the process of doing that involves a lot of money, a lot of science, and a lot of genetics. So you have to generate this thing called a genetic management plan. And that takes a little bit of time. And then that plan, we're actually going to come up with a strategy to do the captive breeding. At the same time, we have to have release sites. And when it comes to the release site, you have to actually go out and look at the site and identify the potential mechanisms of decline for all those individuals you're going to be releasing. And that takes a lot of time, energy, and it takes a pretty good understanding of ecology, because you get into these ethical questions of, am I going to go out into this natural environment and kill these predators that are part of this ecosystem to get this animal forward? To do it, let's say we're going to do that. Well, I have to talk to a lot of people in state and federal government to get permission to do that. If that's something we're going to do, that involves all kinds of permits. And there's oftentimes science that has to go into, well, what's going to happen if we eliminate the predator? Not that I'm promoting eliminating predators, because I certainly am not doing that. It's just for the sake of example. So that whole process is really difficult to get done on a good day, because it also involves an awful lot of oversight, and there's a bureaucracy that you've got to get involved there. So, the idea of the hobby doing that, you're going to need a connection to do that. You can't just breed things and put them out. So, like, if you wanted to get into this wood turtles, I talked about them. I can tell you right now, I don't know of any state that has wood turtle populations that's going to let any hobbyist just take random wood turtles and release them into the wild. You see what I'm, because of the genes and all that kind of good stuff. So in that regard, no. But where I do think that we can help is on two fronts. One front is education. So, this might shock people, but this is where something like a morph might actually come into play, because one of the things I find is I do talks for school groups all the time. And as a hobbyist, I like what nature made. I'm not a morph person. But I can flat out tell you, when I'm talking to fourth graders that come onto the campus, our lavender corn snake that's purple and white, it grabs their attention immediately. And I have gotten many of the adults to basically, this is the first snake I'm going to touch, because it's different. They actually like the fact that this is not what's out in their yard.
That's a great
and that
point.
seems to take an edge off. And in that regard, I think the hobby has tremendous potential for conservation, because with reptiles and amphibians, we're kind of the oddballs of society, if you really think about it, because we love these animals, but the vast majority of people do not. So
some say it's an innate fear, right? Like,
yes.
Oh, you're supposed to be afraid of snakes. Like, what's wrong with me?
Yeah. So in that regard, I think the hobby can help conservation. And then another thing, which I have often thought about this, is that we put so much money into USARK. If we were to pick a group like the Orion Society or ASP, the Association for Snake Preservation, and every hobbyist gave the Orion Society $1 or $2 a year, do you know how much money they would have to do some solid science? And that's going to help us. That's going to give us credibility, because we're absolutely going out into the field. And I can flat out tell you that those nonprofits, I worked for a nonprofit for a little while in environmental ed, and we were starved for money 100% of the time. So, that would be a huge boon to them. And then they're going to advocate that we got this money from the herp hobby. That's a really powerful mechanism of conservation that people don't think about. They think they have to actually be doing what we call ex situ conservation, where you bring the animals off site and breed them. And in reality, you can contribute to conservation and make just as much an impact.
That's a great point. And it reminds me, Dylan, of a conversation you had when you were on Brian Cusco's channel about the Amazon fund that you support with your podcast. Do you mind, is it okay if I ask you to share some of what was going on there?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I think exactly what Zach is saying is correct. There's so many different ways we can contribute. The invisible arc method is a much more extravagant and elaborate plan than most keepers are actually doing. So for myself, I wanted to participate in conservation, being part of the hobby. So I reached out to an Amazon conservation charity that has, sections of the Peruvian rainforest that actually, they have protected land. and it's a Canadian charity. And so every quarter or so, I donate a bunch of money there. I think we've donated almost $1,000 at this point between myself and the listeners, which has been really cool. And so I sell shirts, $5 or whatever goes to them, as well as I donate some of the ad revenue and whatnot. But the experience that I had with them at first is when I approached them with this idea, they said basically go away. They didn't want my donations. And the reason they didn't want it is because they didn't want anyone associated with the reptile trade being associated with a conservation. Now I was able to win them over, but that was my first sort of eye opener. That's how the public sees us. And that was a major problem. So now that's what I say to most people. If you want to participate or say that you're participating in conservation, go find a charity that has, is protecting a section of land that your animals come from. If you're breeding, maybe a small profit from your breeding project goes towards that charity as a donation every time you sell your clutch or litter or whatever. Those are ways that we can actually actively contribute to conservation.
Yeah, absolutely. Put your money where your mouth is, right?
Yeah.
If it's important and you say it's worth it. I've noted before that I try and make any, I did like brief fundraising right when this thing started. I said, look, if anything extra goes over, I'll send it to USARK. But I think a lot more, like Zach said, it's not that USARK isn't valuable, but gosh, there are a lot of conservation efforts that really, really could use the publicity and the funds. Lori, what are your thoughts on, is captivity and captive breeding, is that conservation?
I think just as Zach and Dylan said, it can be. If the animal's part of a species survival plan, if the animals are being bred at an actual center for release into the wild as part of a government-sponsored program, then absolutely, that's conservation. If you're breeding the animals under captive management in order to research their behavior, their biology, so that we better understand how to manage their resources in situ, or how to do better disease management in wild populations, then those can all be legitimate reasons to be breeding captive populations. But if you're just breeding these animals because it's what you want to do, then just say, I'm breeding these animals because I want to. Don't try to say that it's for conservation, because it's not. It's just because you want to breed the animals, but you want to make it sound like it's not for selfish reasons, or you feel like you have to have an excuse for breeding. If you want to breed animals, but don't say it's for conservation if it isn't for one of these legitimate, organized reasons.
That is such a great point. And I think it's so valuable. Thank you so much, all of you guys. I think are great answers. Alex, let me know if that kind of answered your question, because you brought up conservation as well. Should we focus on it more? I just was a little unclear about the second part, so let me know if that answers your question. In the meantime, I'll ask, Zach?
Can I speak to Alex's thing in the chat about the morphs?
Yeah.
I'm just voicing something that I know from personal communication with people. If you want to breed the morphs. And I just gave out a reason as to how they could actually be used in education and things to that nature. But I will flat out tell you, as far as academia is concerned, as far as conservationists are concerned, the morphs, and this is my opinion, do not help the conservation process, because you are taking the natural form of that animal and you are finding some genetic mutation that we think is pretty, but all the science shows that most of those mutations that change the phenotype are oftentimes linked to some kind of internal issue. And what we do is, much like what Dylan was talking about with the spider gene, is that we'll breed the morphs, we narrow that gene pool down, we get that genotype to express that phenotype, the phenotype we like, and then there's some kind of negative aspect to the animal's life. And then I've seen it time and time again. There's this justification for it, or this complete biological fallacy that we can breed it out. You can't breed it out if you've narrowed the gene pool down. It's impossible to get the genes back. And sure, you can have a random mutation, but the likelihood of that random mutation showing up to get rid of the wobble is like 1 in billions of trillions. It's just not going to happen. And I can also say that many professional herpetologists that I know that are academics or work in the field, it's a joke to talk about these morphs. And I think that is something that is just perceived, it's an uncomfortable truth as something that discredits the herpetoculture, the hobby, like scaleless corn snakes. Why? Like, as an ecologist, I think it's cool that they can exist for half a second, but there's no way that animal is living its best life. They evolved scales to have, like, every snake has scales, So if you're into conservation, or you're those people that Lori talked about, where she reached out and they said, I don't want animals in captivity, they're going to only see the scaleless corn snakes, the jag carpet pythons, the motley boas, the spider ball python. They're just going to fixate on that negative, and it's just not good. So it's perceived as something that discredits us in professional circles.
Thanks for sharing that. That's it's informative. I don't think a lot of people realize that when we're on our Facebook groups, that some of the reasons why we're getting a lot of bad information is because the people that really know are staying away. They're and it's, maybe they're looking down, maybe it's an ego, but most likely it's probably because they're a little fed up with the passion towards scaleless corn snakes and putting that on a pedestal, as opposed to, look at how biologically healthy this F4. I've mixed the genes so diversely in my breeding project. Look how wild and natural looking these animals look. It's like, no one wants the brownest rainbow boa, or the you know what I'm saying, like the brownest any snake for the most part, but like so many things like that are in the wild. So thank you for sharing that.
But
yeah,
I'm sorry, Alex put up another question there, and he brought up, getting away from the morphs, to end on a positive though. An example where hobbyists, though, like keeping a line or keeping a phenotype or keeping a population alive through captive management and actually doing the genetics. Yes, in that regard, the private hobby can help. And that is where, once again, I'm going to, give props to the turtle people, because there's zoos that are giving to private hobbyists in the turtle world, where the zoos are basically doing the genetics, figuring out which animals are most genetically distinct. And then these populations are so small that don't all want them in one facility or two facilities. They want to spread them out. And if there's someone that has the knowledge to take care of those animals, that is willing to cover the expense of taking care of the animals, when they cover that expense, in a way, they're absolutely paying into conservation. And that's an example of, like, the other end of the continuum, away from the scaleless corn snakes. That's where the hobby is absolutely contributing to conservation. And I would love to see more of that, but we're going to have to bring the academics and the hobby together, and that can be rather challenging at times.
Yeah, thanks, man. That's so good. If I can jump on too, we've talked a lot about what hobbyists can do to include science in their habits, right, in their keeping and their husbandry. But what about the inverse? And we touched on this a little bit earlier, but what about the opposite? What can the hobbyist do to contribute to science? And I think you answered a lot of that, Zach, but Lori and Dylan, we'll start with you. Lori, did you want to weigh in on that as well, about what hobbyists can contribute to continuing science?
Citizen science is huge in almost every aspect of science. I mean, NASA has citizen science programs. Other organizations have citizen science programs. And I don't think that herpetoculture and herpetology should be any different, especially since so many people who keep reptiles keep large numbers of reptiles in their homes. I mean, I have a large number of reptiles here from my behavior study, but there are breeders out there that are breeding, not for any study, but have large numbers of snakes and other reptiles out there. And they could be collecting so much data on those populations and contributing that to science. Citizen science, I think, is something that we don't utilize enough, that we don't utilize those resources, because I have 2 royal pythons here, and I have them because they're so prevalent among snake keepers. When people get family snakes, it's one of the species that they tend to get. I wanted to be familiar with that species, and so I got 2 of them. But I'm only observing two. I'm not going to fill up my facility with that species because it's not my primary area of focus. And so any data I collect on those two is just going to be an N number of two. But now let's say my neighbor has two and the person down the street has two, and then the breeder I know has 100. And we combine all of those numbers together and we're all collecting the same data, then that becomes a really significant study with significant results.
Terrific. Dylan, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I would echo what Lori says. I think keep records. That's a key. If you're keeping animals, keep records, write down everything. I think there's a tendency for people to think that everything has already been discovered. It's like, what's the point? Like, I'm not going to notice anything different about my corn snake or my, carpet python that hasn't already been seen. But if you look at just the scientific literature in general, reptiles have a tiny little fraction compared to mammals and birds and and even fish. I think we're under fish. What's wrong with people? We need to have more reptile studies. But so you can actually go a long ways, like what Lori's saying, just watching your own animals, writing things down. The conversation I had with Zach on my podcast a couple weeks ago, he noticed things about the water cobra that, yes, it was in an academic setting, but it was also somewhat in a hobbyist setting as well. Things that, were kind of hadn't really been labeled in the scientific literature yet. So all of those things are there for the everyday hobbyist. So keep records and pay attention to your animals. And also, if you like to herp, use iNaturalist. You can also contribute that way.
Oh, that's such a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. And that was something you guys talked about a lot on your podcast as well. Zach, you had mentioned going through iNaturalist, right? And then comparing the data to weatherspark.com to figure out, dial in your husbandry parameters. And I thought that was phenomenal. And I'll put a link in the notes as well for that conversation so everyone can get into that. My favorite part about iNaturalist is just looking up the pictures. I'll go to the region and then I'll click like the grid view and just look at them. One, because cool, but two, actually in a beneficial situation, I really like to do bioactive and naturalistic enclosures, and seeing these in situ pics that people are taking, you say, oh wow, all these animals that I'm finding, they're on rocks. And now, of course, some of them are picked up, some are being held, but some of them are hiding. And it's like, I can put that little rock crevice as opposed to a tree branch. Or it's like, if I'm keeping a certain species of snake in a 12-inch enclosure, 12-inch high, and I see half the pictures of them are on tree branches, it's like, maybe I need to get a little bit more height into that and raise it up. So iNaturalist is such a cool app, if for nothing else, the cool pictures, but using the information to find where they're found, and then you could compare that data to WeatherSpark for your parameters, and also just to get an idea of what an enclosure is going to look like. I think it's phenomenal. And then you could even go broader too and look at the flora as well on iNaturalist too. So you could actually get species of plants if people are logging it in that region. Mm-hmm. Super cool. So guys, we're going to jump into some of the more quick hit questions. Actually, probably just 2 quick hit questions. Then I'll have a fun little lightning round, which I did not give you guys those topics in advance. Just me being stupid. Get ready for it. Mm-hmm. And audience, if any of you guys have questions now, you could always raise your hand like we're in class, either on the Zoom or on the camera, or just type it in the chat as well while we're going through these. But so just quick, Dylan, we'll start with you. If you could see one thing advance and change in the hobby, what would it be?
It would just be to embrace the idea of progression. I don't expect the person who buys their ball python at the beginning to set up a beautiful enclosure with the correct lighting, correct heating, and all that, but to embrace the idea that wherever you start, that's not where you're finished. Continue, progress through the entire length of the animal's life. We can always improve.
That's a good answer. Zach, how about you? One thing to improve upon.
It's pretty much the exact same thing. Just be willing to have somebody challenge your husbandry and actually hear them instead of react to them, and then kind of look inward and come to your conclusions based off of that process. And then fact, don't be afraid that the way you've done things might not be the best. We can always change.
That's a good answer.
That in the hobby.
Lori, how about you?
Just really think about how the species you keep perceives the world. what is their natural history and their natural biology, and what is going to be meaningful to them in the way that you set up your keeping routine and their enclosure.
Awesome. So similar too, this one's a little bit stricter. I'm gonna hold you guys a little bit to the fire on this one. Yeah, we talked about it earlier with regulations. If you had to impose one regulation for either all reptiles or a specific type of reptile or species, what would it be? And we'll go backwards. Lori, what's the one regulation you would make people stick to?
Enclosure size, larger enclosures, large enough enclosures that the animals can exhibit their species typical behaviors.
So what does that mean? Does that mean as long as a snake, or so long that it can
If it's
breathe?
species typical behavior for the snake to stretch out, then yes, it needs to be that long. If it's species typical behavior for the snakes to climb, then they need to be in an enclosure and given things to climb on, not in a 9-inch tub.
Good. Zach, what about you if you're in charge of a new law?
I don't know how to word my law. That's my problem. Basically, if there's evidence that a native species is actually hurting the native fauna, and it has escaped, and there's wild populations that are established, as long as there's like a process to allow people to change with the regulation, but maybe the elimination of that animal being kept at just in the area where the invasive species is, not range wide. So like using tegus as an example, if tegus are released in southern Florida and people are keeping them outside, I don't really see a reason, I'm okay with that. But I also understand that people make their living off of tegus. So you don't just roll in and say, no more tegus, get them out, but you have like a year to adapt. I know that was a very convoluted answer, but I also know I can get a lot of heat for that. But
It's
at the same time,
one.
Yeah, here in West Virginia, where it's -20, it's not -20, where it's 20 degrees outside, we don't need to necessarily have a regulation against tegus because there's a mechanism that can eliminate them from the wild.
Look, that's a controversial stance, but I know where you're coming from, right? And it's for the sake of the environment. So say it. I like it. Dylan, what about you? What's one regulation that you would enforce?
Well, we have Dr. Baines in the house, so we have to say lighting. We can't eliminate that. So I would say lighting in general, from UV through visible into the infrared. Between Roman and Dr. Baines, they've done so much amazing work, and John Courtney Smith as well. And there's just a tiny fraction of the hobby that's starting to tinker with that. And there's so much potential there for just increasing health and wellness of the animals that we keep. So it has to be that.
I love that answer. I was saying too that it's amazing just how incredibly low my bar is for all the Facebook groups, reptile groups that I'm in like 80 something plus. But the ones that I try and engage with and try and really learn from and help people is if someone introduces the idea of keeping a snake with UVB, so long as like the admins and moderators are saying like at least, well, I guess UVB isn't going to hurt the snake. Like, right, there's so much information. That's a whole nother panel where we could talk about how beneficial UV is. But it's amazing how out of the hobby that is and how incredibly important it is for the reptiles, which we've known for so long for lizard species, especially your diurnal lizard species, that it, I don't know, it's kind of shocking at how far behind the hobby is on that. But not to dwell on that super long. Thank you, Dylan. I think that's a really terrific response. We'll start the lightning round question before we say goodbye to everyone. So these are just fun. Answer them as quick as you can. Tell me, Lori, are you afraid of spiders?
No.
Good. Zach, what is the best color?
Blue?
It is. You're right. Dylan, Skittles or M&Ms?
M&Ms.
Okay. Lori, what's the worst name for a pet snake?
Buddy.
You're probably right. Zach, and then again, it's lightning round, so be quick with this one. Reptile hobby pet peeve.
Oh, Jesus. Saying that my way of keeping is the way to do it because I've done it for 25 years. And that's your justification.
That's good. Dylan, I somehow end up with all the ors for you. Dogs or cats?
Dogs.
Dogs. Lori, what's your favorite plant?
My favorite plant? I kill plants. I'm horrible with plants. Sunflowers.
Good. Zach, you probably think about this one all the time. Fame, money, or beauty? You have to pick one.
For God's sake. Money to keep my family safe financially.
That's great. Dylan, would you ever go to space?
Yes.
No, I wouldn't. It's scary. Lori, what jelly goes best with peanut butter?
Grape.
Okay. And Zach, what do you want to see before you die?
I want to see my son get old.
Good. Okay. I'm going to have a Cats in the Cradle moment. That's sweet.
Yeah.
Dylan, what is the best song ever, not Cats in the Cradle?
Oh God, the best song. I have been really listening to a lot of Tyler Childers lately. I don't know if you guys know that, but I love the song Nose to the Grindstone. I have that on repeat all the time.
I'll take your word for it. It's great, and it deserves all the awards. That's it, folks. If you guys have a question, let me know right now. Raise your hand. Otherwise, we're going to say goodbye. Dylan, Zach, Lori, thank you so much for joining us. Anything you guys want to add before we jump out of here? It's been terrific.
Yeah, just thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you guys all, and thank you, Dylan, for having the terrific microphone. I have been using this. I don't know, is Stone Age.
It works.
I think it does though. Once again, everyone, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. You guys were awesome. Really good questions, so I appreciate that engagement. We'll see you for the next one. Have a great night.
Awesome.
Thank you.
See you later.
Bye.
Thank you so much, guys.
And a good morning for everyone who's overseas.
Yeah. Wow. Those committed.
Right.
Thank you all.
Bye.
All right. We'll see you later.
Bye-bye.